We are rolling. Hi, Beck.
Hey Mark, how you doing?
Good. So this is Mark Goldberg with UN Dispatch, and I'm speaking with
With Rebecca Hamilton.
Rebecca Hamilton. And what's you are now affiliated with the university these days, correct?
Yeah, I'm teaching at Columbia Law School.
So we are speaking on Tuesday, January 7th, and the latest figures from the UN from South Sudan sort of speak to a pretty sort of horrifically descending, a pretty horrific situation in general. There's something like nearly 200,000 people displaced, including
Right.
60,000 who are sort of huddled in UN compounds. And you have spent a lot of time reporting on Sudan, on South Sudan's independence. So I thought this would be a sort of a great opportunity to, I guess, pick your brain a bit about sort of what's going on and sort of the sort of get a general sense of what's happening in South Sudan and the sort of consequences of this. I don't know if you'd call it a civil. Would you call what's happening a civil war right now?
Not yet, but I fear it's close.
It could be.
Yeah.
So I guess about a year and a half ago, you wrote this really interesting long read about this cadre of American officials and activists who took a really sort of important and lead role in helping sort of to birth South Sudan as a nation state many years ago. But this sort of all culminated in South Sudan's independence in
Right.
2011. So what I guess I wanted to sort of ask you to kick things off. I mean, to what extent can this not quite civil war that's happening in South Sudan be considered a failure of U.S. policy?
I think that's too simplistic a brush to cast it with. There were many actors involved in the birth of South Sudan, and primarily South Sudanese themselves. So I don't think it wouldn't be accurate to lay the entire of the blame, just as it was not accurate to lay the entirety of the glory um, at the foot of the US alone. That said, the US has obviously been a key player throughout the story of South Sudan's independence. And if there's one thing that I think must have been clear to everybody involved, was that it would always be a huge uphill battle for South Sudan to be viable as a nation. And I think if there's fault to be sort of blame to be cast here, it's the failure to really attend to the political structures, the governance structures of the new nation. Um, and I think that, the crisis that we're seeing right now is at its root a political crisis. And as much as we're hearing, horror stories of ethnic overtones, and certainly that's there in the background, I think it's really important to understand this as a political crisis. And so a lack of attention to the governance structures and the establishment of the nation is certainly something that is blameworthy.
I mean, is there something almost sort of inevitable about sort of South Sudan sort of falling apart like this? I mean, it's a brand new country. It's in a really, really rough neighborhood, surrounded by DR Congo and Central African Republic and its old enemies, Sudan, on the other side. Landlocked, one of the poorest countries on the planet, but also has a substantial amount of oil deposits. I mean, all these things sort of mixed together seem to be almost like a witch's brew for a nation, and makes sort of almost sort of makes you think that South Sudan would be sort of stillborn, and it seems that all these forces are conspiring against it right now as Sudan is disintegrating.
Yeah, I think it lets everyone off the hook much too easily to say that this is inevitable. You're absolutely right. The odds have always been stacked against it because of all the factors that you listed. But what we don't, there are factors on the other side, like the resilience of the South Sudanese people. The stories of, there's a heartbreaking New York Times story today about the lost boys and lost girls of South Sudan, who have been here having had their childhood demolished by war been here, got an education, pulled together enough support to go back and start these projects to provide services for their fellow Southerners. And so, yes, huge odds stacked against the country, but I don't think it's fair to say that what we're seeing is inevitable. It's also a question of what the leadership is doing. And we've been seeing over the recent months, probably in fact all the way through from independence, increasingly authoritarian tendencies from Salva Kiir, the president. And, that's a choice. It's true that it's very difficult for liberation movements to make the transition to being the governors of a nation. And in many ways, what the SPLM, that's the leading party in South Sudan, that controls almost all the meaningful positions of power in the government, to an extent that SPLM is dealing with the curse of all successful liberation movements, by which I mean that the very traits that enabled them to succeed as a liberation movement, including quashing internal dissent, papering over differences in order to seem unified against the common enemy in the north. All of these are disserving them now. They're in a system of needing to actually govern the country.
I mean, I guess to what extent was sort of having that common enemy in sort of Sudan, Khartoum, in North Sudan, sort of a unifying factor in the country?
Huge. Absolutely huge. I don't think it can be underestimated for a moment. And so the challenge with independence was always going to be, could you substitute that unifying common enemy for a different unifying vision? And that different unifying vision needed to be nationhood. But there was a huge challenge with an expectation mismatch. I remember, I did scores of interviews in very rural areas in South Sudan in the build-up to independence. And, consistently what I would hear from people was when they talked about what it would mean to have independence, they assumed that it would mean there would be electricity in their villages, schools for their children, clean water, and that all of this would happen very, very quickly. And, as you said, the development indicators on South Sudan are just appalling. There was no way that even the most sort of professional and long-standing government would have been able to match those expectations. Certainly this brand new government wasn't able to. And so there was always a risk that people would feel discontented with the new government, and that would make it harder to build into this new vision of nationhood. All of that said is not to let off the hook what the failings of the new government, because corruption has been rife. As you say, the perfect storm with the petrodollars coming in. So I don't think that the leadership have served their population well. But even if they had done, there would have been an expectation mismatch.
So this current crisis sort of kind of blew up on 15th of December last year.
Right.
When the President Salva Kiir accused his main rival, the ex-VP Riek Machar, of fomenting a coup. What can you tell us about sort of these two individuals?
They have very long histories. I was actually, the memory is so clear right now. I was with Riek Machar on the first day of the referendum, the vote for independence. Most of the foreign correspondents were in Juba, the capital, following the President Salva Kiir, and I was up in Bentu, which is a very sort of part of the capital of an oil-rich unity state and Riek Machar's homeland area. Anyway, as to these two personalities, very different in very personal terms, in that Salva Kiir is incredibly unassuming, doesn't come across as the model we have in our head of a sort of confident statesman. he has a confidence, but it's quiet. Riek Machar, on the other hand, is this incredibly charismatic, larger-than-life figure. Politically, the history is complicated. In the 90s, there was a huge split within the liberation movement, the SPLM, with Riek Machar and another southerner, Lamakol, breaking off from the then head of the SPLM, John Garang. Now, as I suspect many of your listeners will know, John Garang, seen as the founding father of South Sudan, was killed in a helicopter crash shortly after the signing of the peace agreement that ultimately led to independence. One of his deputies in the military commander was Salva Kiir throughout those years. And so Kiir has, as I say, this history with Riek Machar, because that split within the SPLM during the 90s, it was a bloody, bloody split. And the people that paid the price, as is inevitably the case, were Southerners, civilians. One of the most memorable incidents, and you've seen some reporting out this, was the 1991 Boer massacre. This was shortly after the split, and Nuer soldiers, Riek Machar is from the Nuer ethnic group, Nuer soldiers that were loyal to him led a massacre in Boer of an estimated 2,000 civilians, civilians who were Dinka, which is what John Garang was and what Salva Kiir is. So the Dinka and the Nuer are the two largest ethnic groups in Sudan, and there has been the political players have used over time those different ethnicities for their own ends.
And I guess so. One interesting sort of thing that you're seeing, sort of diplomatically come from this, is that there seems to have been a really, really quick response among many of the regional sort of players. Right. Uganda, Kenya, all sort of swooped into Juba, saying, we have to put a lid on this. We have to put a lid on this sort of quickly and soon. And there are currently, I guess, peace talks that seem to be faltering. Again, this is a sort of a moving situation, and we're recording this on Tuesday the 7th. But what way out do you see right now for the situation? I mean, do you see Machar and Kiir coming together at all and sort of, resolving their differences politically right now? I guess what could be and what is a sort of likely sort of international diplomatic solution to this crisis?
Yeah. So let's maybe try to paint out a few scenarios. One is that, in fact, we have already passed a tipping point, and the negotiations are not going to be able to deal with what is happening on the ground militarily. I hope that that's unlikely, but I think that's certainly one possibility. I think the most likely scenario, and one that is a good enough, but to my mind ultimately not helpful in the long-term scenario, is that we have this huge focus of international attention now that does just enough to pull the country back from the brink of civil war. Some kind of short-term arrangement between Riek Machar and Salva Kiir that gets us through to the scheduled 2015 elections in South Sudan. As you said, interestingly, regional players have all stepped up, and they know it's in their self-interest. They know what an unstable, volatile South Sudan looks like. They know that it means refugee flows over their borders. It's in their own interests for this to be solved. But what you have right now is also major international players. The Chinese foreign minister is there in Addis Ababa today. You had Secretary of State John Kerry, I thought really interesting on Sunday, starting his presser on Israel-Palestine, talking about South Sudan. So a very high level of engagement. And part of that is also the oil that is stuck in South Sudan. Oil fields have been shut down with this fighting. And that's why you've also seen Sudan itself engaged. So there's this moment of a huge amount of international attention. as I say, I think the most likely scenario is that they cobble together enough of an agreement between the two leading players that the international community can kind of put South Sudan off the emergency list. For my money, that would be a missed opportunity. Obviously, we need to get it off the emergency list, and from the perspective of civilians on the ground, certainly those steps need to happen. But if the world walks away at that point, it's not enough. Because the root causes of this, I do believe, lie in the governance structure of the new nation. And so, one could conceive of this, and perhaps we will look back on this from a historical perspective as a moment where an enormous alarm bell went off, a devastating one, a one that has left thousands of civilians killed and hundreds of thousands displaced. But nevertheless, a moment of opportunity to really take stock at what it would take for South Sudan to be viable over the long term. And what is clear is that it cannot be a multi-party state in name only, which is what it is right now. The SPLM runs the whole system. And to the extent that it is in the interim period, there need to be systems within the SPLM for handling dissent through political channels. Because if not, then it is extremely likely that every political dispute that comes up will be played out through the military and at the cost of civilian lives. And so it really, I think, is a moment to get the leadership to commit to structural governance reform. And, that's not something that you're going to see headlines about. Mm-hmm. But that's actually what I think is needed for the viability of the nation going forward.
So I guess in terms of sort of who can get the government to commit to that reform, I mean, how much influence does, say, the United States have over affairs in Juba? I mean, on the one hand, it's almost as if Salva Kiir is sort of like an American creation. The U.S., I mean, on the one hand, he wears that black cowboy hat that was supposedly given to him by George W. Bush.
Bush. Yeah.
And I was looking for photos of Salva Kiir. And I just got, like 8 different photos with him and George W. Bush, and then a photo with him and Obama. I mean, he, has had very close relations with the United States. The U.S., again, was one of the major champions of the creation of South Sudan, of the 2005 Comprehensive Peace Agreement that gave birth to South Sudan. But how much? But then again, the U.S. is not a big investor in South Sudan, at least compared to, say, the Chinese, which have deep oil interests. So I guess what leverage does the U.S. have to sort of affect affairs in Juba?
I think of all the countries in the world, this is one where the U.S. actually does have even more leverage now. Than in an earlier period. In many countries, I think US leverage is on the decline, but I don't think that's the case in South Sudan, because the leadership of South Sudan know very well that they owe really their success to date in large part to having an international backer like the US. Obviously, the work for independence was done by South Sudanese themselves. But there are a lot of would-be independence movements out there, and very few of them get blessed by a major international player like the US. And that was the great stroke of luck that the South Sudanese, I guess, had. And, it wasn't a stroke of luck. It was the cultivation of these personal relationships over many years. So those personal relationships are still very strong. All of the people who were involved in being champions for South Sudan's independence, the so-called council that I wrote about for that Reuters report, they're all, on the phone with the leadership, urging them to take the responsible decisions here. And then, as you say, we're in the situation where, indeed, it's not only the US that has leverage. China has an enormous amount of leverage with its investments. And I think, South Sudanese know that they do need international support.
And how?
So I think...
how has China used that leverage sort of in this sort of in this peace talks and sort of as I know, I mean, China is one of the countries that has the most direct financial stake and stability in South Sudan.
I mean, I think it's telling that the Chinese Foreign Minister, Mr. Wang, is actually there in person in Addis today.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's too early to, it's too early. The peace talks, direct talks have only just started today. It's too early to say what the impact of that will be. I think reading the headlines today, the concern is that the Chinese care very much about their infrastructure investments, care very much about the oil continuing to flow, as does Sudan. But are the policy agreements that come as a result of that going to also be what is needed for the South Sudanese people?
Mm-hmm. Like they probably don't care as much about the governance issues that you were talking about before as being central to a sort of more durable solution to this crisis.
They may not right now, but if I was in the position of counselling them, I would say that they should be, because if they're concerned about long-term stability, which obviously they need to be,
mm-hmm.
Then it's going to come down to this governance reform issue.
So, like, one of the particularly tragic sort of things about sort of the current sort of descent into near civil war in South Sudan has to do sort of in a way with Darfur. Something you write about in your book and that's been reported on is sort of how for many years as the Darfur genocide was unfolding, there was a great criticism of international policy and of U.S. policy in particular that sort of in a way the U.S. was trading the genocide in Darfur for the comprehensive peace agreement in 2005 that led to the creation of South Sudan. And sort of by that I mean the sort of criticism was that that U.S. policy was not hard enough on Khartoum, hard enough on the government of Sudan, and pushing them to stop the genocide in Darfur because they didn't want to disrupt negotiations that eventually led to the creation of South Sudan. And, it seems that we're on this sort of precipice or we're about to enter the situation where we had both the genocide in Darfur and a potential mass atrocity event unfolding in South Sudan. And I want to sort of get your take on I guess that to me seems to be one of the sort of real tragedies of this all is that, yes, I guess, do you agree that the U.S. in a way traded sort of Darfur for South Sudan? And if so, what are the consequences of what we're seeing happening in South Sudan to that sort of policy decision made a decade ago?
Yeah. So look, any country only has a limited amount of leverage in any situation. And, unlike, I think, the position between the US and South Sudan today, the position of leverage that the US had over the Sudanese government once Iraq turned into the quagmire that it turned into, became much more limited than perhaps the public perception was. And so in that world of limited leverage, do you preference the peace agreement or do you preference pushing them on Darfur? So certainly I think trade-offs were made. I don't think that is I think if you got any US government official off the record on that, that wouldn't be a particularly controversial statement. The tragedy, as you say, will be that we've ended up potentially in the worst of all worlds, having taken some of the heat off Sudan vis-a-vis Darfur in order to secure the independence of South Sudan. Is South Sudan now going to fall apart because of a failure to then push the Southern Sudanese leadership to undertake the kind of governance reforms that, ironically enough, needed to be taken in the north as well? I mean, I think one very plausible way of understanding the crisis in Darfur over the years was also of a failure of governance and the governance system that is set up in the north with all of the power centralized in Khartoum. So yes, I mean, I don't know if that answers the question. Yes, trade-offs were made, and yes, we're potentially ending up in the worst of all worlds.
Well, I mean, does it suggest that that decision, a decade ago was the wrong one? I mean, should policymakers, should American policymakers have not sort of been so singularly focused on striking a peace deal between Sudan and South Sudan?
I think it's it would be very easy for me to sit here and say that as someone who is not in the hot seat. And with the benefit of hindsight, I think.
Well, you have both the benefit of hindsight and you're not in the hot seat, so go for it.
Yeah, I mean, I think the argument can be made. I don't know. To be honest, the North-South War, 2 million lives lost, 20 years of war, more than 20 years of war. If you wanted to make the argument, make the case on strictly sort of utilitarian grounds, there needed to be some kind of resolution of that. And I don't think, I think they were in a world of bad choices. You would want both to be achieved. And perhaps what I would say as someone who's not in the hot seat is that you could have pushed harder for both. And really, that would have come down to extending your leverage, building your leverage, which would have meant in turn trading off other parts of your foreign policy. Really making compromises in your relationship with China over other aspects of the foreign policy, that bilateral relationship, in order to pull together greater leverage over Sudan. That certainly could have been done and wasn't done. So I don't think it's that, Darfur should have been pursued instead of the CPA. I think it's that if you could have made Sudan as a whole, the entire region, more of a priority, then you could have drawn more pieces of leverage to the table. But we're at where we are at now, and I think it's too soon to say that this is unsalvageable. We're only 3 years into the life of this new nation. It's not too late for the governance reform to be undertaken. And I think if you had that, plus the ongoing commitment and a bolstering, in fact, of development assistance from China, from the US, so that people, particularly in the rural areas, do get the dividends that they're expecting from independence in terms of development, schools, roads, etc., then I think that the country could be set on a viable path.
So I'm sure you saw the reports yesterday that Omar al-Bashir actually went to Juba to try to
right.
To try to I guess as part of like a peace envoy. What do you sort of make of his role in sort of the current crisis? I mean, has he sort of surreptitiously sown sort of the seeds of discord? What role does sort of Sudan proper play in the conflict in South Sudan right now?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think it's important to note historically that whenever there have been divisions within the South, Khartoum's hand has often been there. Its approach during the long civil war was very much a sort of divide and conquer, and it effectively outsourced a lot of its war effort by supporting different militia in the South. So you had Southerners killing Southerners. So there's always a sort of something in the back of your brain that makes you nervous when there's South-on-South violence, that Khartoum's hand has been in there. But there's certainly I've seen no concrete evidence of that in this particular case. And I do think that there is enough history just between Southerners themselves that we don't have to assume that Khartoum was behind this. I think that would be...
and it's probably fair to say that, Khartoum, isn't benefiting from this, right? I mean, the oil that's produced in South Sudan has to flow through, pipelines and through and exit sort of the continent of Africa via ports in Sudan proper. So if oil production slows down, their economy is hit, correct?
That's exactly right. And so that's why, I mean, I was going to say, I think, notwithstanding that history that leads people often to be skeptical of Khartoum when it's got any involvement with the South, I think what we have here is pure self-interest at work. The economy in the North, Khartoum knows, is struggling. It needs it. Bashir needs it in order for him to secure his power, which has also been somewhat under threat in Sudan itself. So yeah, self-interest is absolutely at work in favor of getting those oil fields secure. I have to say, it's just the sense of al-Bashir being in Juba yesterday saying, you know, any southern Sudanese are welcome to essentially flee to Sudan, given the history of discrimination against Southerners in Sudan, is ironic to say the least.
And you know, the sort of just north of the South Sudanese border is a conflict zone within Sudan where Sudanese government forces have been sort of waging a war of attrition on political and ethnic groups that have traditionally allied with the South, right? In the
Right.
Blue Nile region and Kordofan. And that, I mean, that's
Exactly.
sort of that region of the world. That's one of the sort of most dire humanitarian emergencies sort of on the planet, right?
Right, and you know, we need to try, amongst everything else that is going on in Sudan and South Sudan, not forget that is an ongoing emergency, and that people have been trying to flee from there into South Sudan for refuge, that in turn now is feeling much less safe. Yeah, horrific situation there as well.
So I guess just to wrap things up, I mean, sort of in the coming days, is there anything we can look out for that would sort of augur well or poorly for sort of this political peace process that's happening in Addis right now? I mean, what are there signs that things are that things are going to come to a resolution, or that things are going to become sort of much worse before any resolution is possible? What should we be looking out for?
Okay, so in terms of things to look out for, I think a very bad sign will be if what we see coming out of the negotiations in the next few days is a focus on this micro issue of whether the political prisoners, these are 10 or 12 members of the SPLM who Kiir detained alleging that they've been part of a coup attempt with Riek Machar, worth saying that they're from different ethnic groups, not just Machar's Nuer ethnic group, which underscores again the political nature of this crisis rather than it being at root an ethnic crisis. But to the extent that we are seeing all of the focus in negotiations on whether they should be released or not, my worry is that is just extending the amount of time that on the ground military positions can be shored up. So the more that Riek Machar with the rebellion can secure these key strategic oil regions, obviously the more leverage that gives him at the negotiating table. And so it's in his interest to extend out the negotiations and get them very tied up on what is actually a micro issue in the broader scheme of things, though I guess if you're one of the political prisoners, it doesn't feel so micro. So that's what I'm going to be watching for in the coming week. Then once we get through that, I think there's going to be a big question over, presumably we'll move to a ceasefire, who is going to be doing the monitoring of that, and who is really a neutral and honest broker in the region. Uganda obviously is concerned because of the refugee flows coming into its borders, but it has already sided itself with Salva Kiir. Who do both parties accept as a neutral arbiter of whatever agreement they come to?
Wouldn't it?
And then,
I mean, sorry to interrupt, but wouldn't that sort of naturally be sort of the role of the UN peacekeeping mission?
Yes, but then you've got another question over just the resource stretch of that mission. You know, 5,500 additional peacekeepers sent in, but now they're dealing with huge numbers of displaced and everything that flows. So we've got a resource kind of overstretch problem
So
there.
some numbers that there's something like, see, the original sort of the UN peacekeeping mission in South Sudan originally had 75,000 people deployed to it, but as this sort of crisis exploded, the Security Council increased that number to 12,500. But now I think there are currently something like 8,000 or 8,500 peacekeepers in the country, but they are relegated to protecting something like 60,000 civilians that have sought refuge in various UN compounds around
Made
the
it to
country.
the UN bases, right?
Yeah, UN bases. So they are doing nothing but civilian protection right now. So that's interesting.
Which is a crucial task for them to be doing.
I think it's worth pointing out that, and this is something I wrote on UN Dispatch today, is that the sort of situation on the ground would probably be much, much worse from a sort of atrocity perspective if these sort of civilians were not able to find refuge on these UN compounds and be protected by these UN peacekeepers. But that question you bring up, though, I mean, these peacekeepers are busy protecting civilians, and there are a finite number of them, so they probably wouldn't be able to guarantee a ceasefire agreement, right? They wouldn't be able to stop protecting these civilians and go out on patrols along the front lines, which is a fascinating sort of question about the limitations of UN peacekeeping that I hadn't thought of. So that was very interesting. Yeah. So I guess if not for UNMISS, who would do the guaranteeing of this peace agreement?
I mean, it's whether there can be additional peacekeeping like resources that are granted on a temporary basis from, Ethiopia, although they too have already contributed enormously when it comes to monitoring in Abyei. But this could lead us into, I think, a much different, related but much bigger discussion about who in the world is doing UN peacekeeping, who is paying for it, and how quickly, how reflexively we say, oh, well, the UN can do it. Without really thinking through in concrete terms who that is, what the costs are. But I don't want to lose the thread of what we're looking out for with the negotiations, which is, the first step about not getting too caught up in micro issues that enable the parties to sort of secure locations on the battlefield. Then moving beyond that to getting into ceasefire agreements. But the thing that I'll be looking for at that point is, does, the Chinese foreign minister leave? Do the sort of the heavyweights in the international system walk away at that point, thinking, okay, well, there's a ceasefire and now we can move on to something else? Or do they stay engaged enough to start to look at the root causes of this and be serious about ensuring the viability of the nation going forward?
Well, Rebecca, thank you so much.
Yeah, great to speak to you.
This was interesting, and sorry it's over this tragic circumstances, but I'm so glad that I was able to hear your insights, and the Blogging Head universe was able to hear your take on this. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Mark.